I'm Professor John Charmley, Provost of St Mary's University, Twickenham, and I want to welcome you to this Newman Conversation, one of an associated series of conversations with eminent scholars that accompany our Newman Lecture Series, which is part of our collaboration at St Mary's with the Diocese of East Anglia, which is why we're in Cathedral House at St John's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Norwich. And it's a delight to have with me my old friend Professor John Morrill from Cambridge, who is not only an eminent historian, but does an awful lot of work for the Catholic Church. And we're here today to talk about two of the great Catholics of the 19th century English Catholic Church, both of whom started, of course, as Anglicans, St. John Henry Newman and Henry Manning. And we will be discussing their career, focusing in particular on what was then not called the First Vatican Council, the Vatican Council of 1870, which of course resulted in the declaration of the definition of papal infallibility. So we shall move on and we shall discuss that right now, John. So great pleasure to have you with us.
Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Certainly any of us who engage in education in the Catholic sphere in this country owe everything to Manning. Manning, after all, John, as you know, all the rich donors wanted to have a Catholic cathedral in London. Absolutely. And as you know, Manning refused until, what was it, that
every Catholic child had a free education.
That's right. Now, you know, and St Mary's itself, which was founded in 1850 by Manning's predecessor, Wiseman, of course was absolutely devoted to that cause of providing teachers for what the Victorians, of course, in their very uneuphemistic way, used to call poor Catholic schools. So in many senses, John, I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that Manning's been rather eclipsed and rather forgotten.
I think it's very unfortunate because he's a great man in his own right. It's also true that if we just start with something very basic, he never broke friends with Newman. Newman, at a certain point, thought he'd been very badly let down by Manning and did bear, not a grudge, but a sort of a hurt. Mm-hmm. Whereas Manning continued, even though Newman seemed to be doing things that made his life more difficult and getting himself into trouble with Rome, he always supported him. So he supported him, for example, to become a cardinal in 1878. Very unusual for someone who was a parish priest running a small community in Birmingham to be made a cardinal and given the extraordinary privilege of not having to live in Rome but to stay put. When Newman was less than wholehearted in his support for the decree of infallibility we're going to come on to, it was Manning who defended him in a magnificent letter to Rome, saying, look, it will be counterproductive, and actually his heart is in the right place. And actually when Newman died, an 83-year-old Manning preached a great sermon at Newman's funeral. So he never gave up on Newman, even though Newman at times was pursuing a track that wasn't the one that he himself preferred.
And of course they did go back an awful long way. I mean, right back to their Oxford days.
Yeah.
And I think that's perhaps something to start with, that they come from not dissimilar sorts of background.
That's right. I mean, Manning is slightly up the higher the social scale. He had a former prime minister as his godfather. He's integrated with some of the great families. And Manning was at college with Gladstone, and that gave him, as it were, a link into the top of politics for the rest of his life. But both of them had fathers who were bankers. Both of them had fathers who were bankers who went bust. Both of them went to Oxford, and both of them became caught up in the very bitter debates and arguments within the Church of England. They were on the same side of those debates. In fact, they both start off actually on the evangelical wing, but become leaders of what I suppose we can call the High Church wing. And they were for 10 years, very much pulling in the same direction. And then there were differences between them, and they began to pull apart in the 1840s. And Newman, I suppose, gives in to the Holy Spirit and becomes a Catholic 5 years before Manning. And Manning's initial reaction is complicated. Manning wrote a very generous letter to Newman saying, look, we can't be friends anymore now that you've become a Catholic, but you must pray for me and I will pray for you that we'll be united in heaven, which is a wonderful way of dealing with that issue. But then Manning looked in his diary and found to his horror that he'd agreed to give an anti-popery sermon, not only an anti-popery sermon on the 5th of November that year, which is only a couple of months hence, but also an anti-popery sermon in Newman's old church. Well, he does it because he's been committed to doing it, and then he apologises to Newman, and Newman doesn't accept his apology. He finds that is a betrayal, and that is a thing from which there were ongoing difficulties. Though I do think Manning always tried to make allowances for it. There's a wonderful story that Manning, when Newman wouldn't answer his letters, walked out to the countryside where Newman was, knocked on the door, and Newman wouldn't answer it. Manning, in distress, walked back into Oxford and then found he'd left his hat on a seat. And of course in those days gentlemen always wore hats in public, so as he walked up the high street he felt this terrible feeling of opprobrium, people looking at a gentleman without a hat, and he felt that was a judgment on him. But at any rate, they have these, their lives are in parallel. Their lives are in parallel, but they do rub up against one another. Neither is willing, as it were, to become an enemy of the other, but they simply frustrate one another by the different emphases there are in the way in which they see God and the Church.
And I think where I'd want us to go next is first of all, that element of the Church. Because Newman, of course, goes first, Newman converts first, and Manning comes later. And yet, of course, it is Manning whose preferment is speedy. And of course, to some extent, I tempt you out on this, I think it is partly to do with their different gifts of character. It seems to me there's a sense in which, because you mentioned that Manning had been better connected. Manning, of course, had been an archdeacon. Manning was, if you like, much more diplomatically skillful, and I think much more of a social being in the sense that he was a networker.
Yeah.
I mean, probably actually one of the most formidable networkers that the Catholic Church in England has ever seen.
Yeah.
As we shall see later. I mean, hence his influence on what was never called Vatican I at the time.
Indeed.
Whereas Newman is in many senses, he's a much spikier figure because he is, in one sense, he's the archetypal scholar.
Yeah.
He goes where the Spirit moves him without too much regard for anything else.
Yeah.
Whereas, so I think sometimes it's said that the Catholic Church doesn't know what to do with Newman. I'm not sure the Anglican Church knew what to do with Newman either.
No.
Because there's a sense in which, like so many saints, Newman is a difficult man because he is so individual, he is so driven by what the Holy Spirit is saying to him that he doesn't always relate to you either get what Newman is and you follow him. Not that Newman ever sets out to have followers, but he gets them wherever he goes, or you don't. But there's no compromise. Whereas Manning, it's easier to see, and it was easier for Wiseman in particular to see Manning's gifts, because Manning brought into the Church, and you've got to remember, of course, this is so soon after the restoration of the hierarchy, and the Catholic Church, we're only 20 odd years away from the Church having been outlawed in this country. So Manning, where Newman brings, and we can see in retrospect, but also at the time, Newman brings an intellect and a writing style beyond parallel, and a spiritual dimension that is we're still exploring today. Yeah. All of that's quite difficult for, if you like, ordinary people to deal with. And what does a church do with it?
Yeah.
Whereas with Manning's gifts are many, but they are, it seems to me, Manning's gifts are much more easily assimilable, not least into a church that is really looking for somebody who knows how to run things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talked to Martin before as a builder. I mean, he is a builder, and he's a very effective builder. And so not only is he a really good networker, and therefore a very good fundraiser, for example, but he's also, you know, just always looking at how you can build the structures of the church, both physical and practical. Newman isn't. I mean, Newman is disorganised rather than organised, and several of the things that he starts, like the university in Ireland, you know, don't have the kind of vigour that that Manning brought to his creations. So, on the other hand, of course, it led to one of his great writings. So the university failed, but the idea of the university, you know, prevailed and is still influential today. There's a big difference, I think, in that when Newman converted, he was immediately ordained and immediately put to work. And although he had in the past been in Rome for short periods, he isn't a great traveller and he isn't a great internationalist. I mean, he's very much an Englishman. And his perceptions are very much about England and the reclaiming of England. Whereas when Manning is converted, he too is immediately ordained, but then he's sent to Rome for 3 years. And those 3 years in Rome give him a very internationalist view. And he becomes, you know, one of the things that is a kind of difference between them is that he comes back saying all our clergy must dress like Italian clergy, you know, all our vestments must be Italian, and all the music must be only that which we have in Rome. And so he tries, as it were, to impose, I suppose you could call it a universalist model on the church, which was never of any great interest to Newman. So there are those sort of temperamental differences.
And these seem to me to log on, bringing us to the Great Vatican Council. These seem to me to log on to the two great questions that are convulsing the Catholic Church, not just the Catholic Church, but particularly convulsing the Catholic Church by Pius IX's reign.
Yeah.
One of which is to do with the, if you like, the governance of the Church. After all, we're at the period here where the papal states are still a reality. They actually literally divide Italy. So any chance of a united Italy, you've got the kingdom of the two Sicilies in the south. You've got the papal states as you move up the leg.
Which we should point out is about a quarter of Italy.
Absolutely,
right over from the Rome on the west, right up to the northeast.
And is a theocracy. Or as Gladstone called it, the vindication of God directed into a system of government, you know, and not the most efficient thing. So that you've got, so from the point of view of secular nationalism, so, you know, Italian liberals, but also liberals elsewhere, nationalists elsewhere, see the papacy as a dreadful rival and an obstacle, and almost as a survival from the, well, literally a survival from medieval times, although of course much older. So in that sense, who should govern? Well, the 19th century is an era where, certainly in Western Europe, post-French Revolution, the progressives were on the side of nationalism and secularism. Rome stands against that. So the question becomes, one of the questions is, well, what's the authority of the Pope? Who governs the Church? Now that maps onto, of course, a much older debate within the Church, which, I mean, ironically, again, the French have been at the centre of. So the French are at the centre of this challenge from nationalism and liberalism. But earlier, of course, the challenge had been Gallicanism, the idea that, you know, national churches, because what was the authority of the Pope? So one of the things that you come to with the First Vatican Council is it is actually partly to do with what is the authority of the Pope. That's not quite the same as, of course, the Pope's responsibility for dogma. The two are just a bit different, and they often get mixed up. So it seems to me that on that side of it, oddly enough, although Newman and Manning are often portrayed as being on different sides over infallibility, they're not, I think, on the same side either on that question, because as you pointed out, Manning comes back almost, well, you couldn't say more Roman than the Romans, not then. You couldn't really be more Catholic than Pio Nono. Don't think that.
No, but you see, I mean, they had a tremendous rapport between
Absolutely.
them. I mean, through the agency of aristocratic Englishmen who were around the court of Rome, he was drawn into Pio Nono's circle, and Pio Nono saw him as a man of action, as a man of. I mean, he saw all those qualities in him. He discerned those qualities in him. And he sent him back to England. And immediately he set to work, because the thing from his Anglican days right through to his deathbed, Manning had a preferential option for the poor. And he was sent back, and he was asked essentially to set up a community in imitation of St. Charles Borromeo, the great saint of the 16th century. To reach out to all the destitute and the poor, and to have a ministry to them, to create a community of priests who would serve the poorest of the poor. So he sends him back with that intention, but at the same time he has a problem in that Wiseman is getting old, and the Pope had rather prematurely appointed somebody else, George Errington, to be his auxiliary with a right to succeed, and then Wiseman and Errington have terrible fallings out. Not least about Manning, because Errington is very jealous of Manning, and thinks that Manning is getting too much power. And the Pope's response to that is to sack Errington and to put Manning in as the provost of the chapter, and that puts him right close next to Wiseman. I mean, let's just remember that 14 years after a widower, and a widowed archdeacon in the Church of England, 14 years after he becomes a Catholic, he becomes the Archbishop of Westminster. And it's an astonishing thing. Now, there are negative reasons for that, because all the other bishops disliked one another so much that they couldn't agree who should replace Wiseman, and the dying Wiseman, and tells Pio Nono, we'll put it Manning. And Manning is actually put in, although he isn't on the turner. The Pope ignores it. So it's an extraordinary rise for Manning. And I've now forgotten what your question is.
Well, the point here is that, if you like, in this issue of who governs, one of the things he comes back with is the Pope governs.
Yes. But what I was going to say is Manning had always been, and in fact it was the main reason for his conversion, was over what was called Erastianism. That's to say, of the church being dominated by the state, of becoming a department of state. And he saw that the problems with that for the Church of England. And when secular courts, the Privy Council in fact, overruled a bishop over whether someone the bishop thought was a heretic should be appointed to a living, when the state said, never mind what the bishop says, that man is going to become, and when someone who virtually everybody in the Church of England thought was a heretic was made a bishop, that was the kind of thing. And he saw the same threats happening with the rise of the isms. Manning had a great concern, as did Pio Nono, about the rise of the isms: nationalism, liberalism, socialism, rationalism. All these were creating these powerful secular states that were eating away at the rights of the church and churchmen across Europe. And how would you protect the church against that, and to ensure the unquestioned authority of the undoubted leader of the Christian world, the Pope? That matters in a really powerful way to Manning, in the way that it didn't to Newman.
Totally. I think that gets a crucial point, that for Manning, as for Pio Nono, this is about resisting the isms. But one of the isms is the old Gallicanism.
Yes, it is.
The idea that, which was, that almost been schisms in the 18th century over. And popes had not pushed it too far for fear of schism, but the question was hanging there: how much authority did the Pope really have over a national church? And one of the things that the Vatican Council is convened to do is actually to answer that question, and it's to answer it in what in the parlance of the time was called the ultramontane sense, that the power of the Pope went over the mountains.
Yeah.
And it was the Pope who appointed bishops. The Pope has the right. Now, that then shades into the other question that dominates the Council, which is, in matters of doctrine, what is the authority of the Pope?
Yeah.
But it's governance and authority, and I think it's worth stressing they're not the same thing, although they're related.
But if I can just pick up on something else you said there, it's very important and rarely kind of emphasised that it had been 320 years since the last council. It's the longest period since the death of Christ there hadn't been a council.
Yeah.
And when there were councils every century, or even more, when there were councils every century, of course there was another mechanism. And councils, there had been a debate which had split the church, in fact, but there had been a debate about how great the Pope's power was outside the council, but nobody doubted the power of the Pope in a council, and it had generally been found by popes that they couldn't necessarily get all they wanted out of a council, but they very rarely had to accept anything from a council they didn't want. So it was a bit like Tudor monarchs and Parliament. You know, it was a useful device. Council were useful devices. I think it's very important that Pio IX saw that here's the paradox, that he needed a council to give him power outside a council.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful paradox, and it's one of the ways in which he and Manning are absolutely on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
And as you say, for Newman, and there's a sense in which it's slightly odd, because Newman, of course, had been as opposed to Erastianism as anybody.
Yeah.
But it
wasn't as load-bearing.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
As it was for Manning.
It wasn't, and I think it is. And in that sense, Newman feels that. I think Newman does feel that the council is not necessary.
Yeah.
And as we shall see in a few minutes, he certainly feels that the declaration over infallibility is not only not necessary, it's probably counterproductive.
Yeah.
But for Manning and Pio IX, this is a crucial part, if you like, of the fight back, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and its importance is in fact, in the sense there being a declaration rather than what's in the declaration. To have a declaration by a general council of all the bishops.
Well, it's the first time. I mean, Trent went on for what, 20 years?
Yeah, in spasms.
Spasms
Yeah.
here and there. So,
Yeah.
and of course, the circumstances in which the Vatican Council takes place are, of course, extraordinary.
Yeah.
Because this is since the wars of Italian unification. Of course, the papal states had been, and Rome had been protected.
Yeah.
Rome itself had been protected by French troops.
Yeah. And of course, there's a memory that, of course, Rome had been occupied before during the French Revolution.
Indeed.
The Pope had been a prisoner of Napoleon, and Napoleon had dictated, a humiliating concordat, which gave the state, extreme power over the French Church, much of which had survived.
Yeah.
And so the memory of what happened when the popes were prisoners of, having that kind of power in himself to be would strengthen him if he didn't have time, if there was no opportunity to call general councils, or even just to call large numbers of bishops together. To consult, because there are all kinds of consultative processes which would give an authoritative ruling, but there had to be ultimately a single source of authority for the extreme circumstances. And those extreme circumstances seemed to be imminent.
As indeed they were, because of course, as we know, the Vatican Council is suspended. Indeed. Well, it's not actually, I think, officially closed till 1963, is it?
Exactly. It's longer than the Council of Trent.
Longer than the Council of Trent. So it is called in. It's not just that there is this fight back by the Church against what one might label modernism in all its forms, but there is literally a literal danger to the Church, because if the Italian government had decided to occupy the Vatican, the Church couldn't have stopped it.
No.
So there is a real danger. So this is not just, as it were, spiritual. This is practical.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, again, and Manning's role in getting the council working, I think, again, is much underappreciated.
You know, lots of bishops, I've forgotten how many, something like 300 or 400 bishops turned up in Rome for the 1800th anniversary of the death of St. Peter, and obviously the great Jamboree in Rome. And during that, Manning and a good friend from the Curia went down into the crypt, and they went to the tomb of St. Peter, and they took a solemn oath that they would secure a decree of infallibility for the Pope at the upcoming council. The Pope had announced the council just before that, but that is how committed he is. And because he's a man of business, because he gets things done, because he's a diplomat, Pio Nono asks him to be a key figure in the actual shaping of the agenda for the council. That's interesting. Just before we get anywhere else, that the mechanism was each conference of bishops would elect one of their own to be on the steering committee, and it's very interesting that the English bishops didn't choose Manning. They chose the Archbishop of Southwark, or then Bishop of Southwark, Grant. Then mysteriously his name didn't go forward, and in fact there was very widespread suspicion that the whole thing was gerrymandered. It was a secret ballots which were looked at by members of the Curia, and surprisingly every single member was a hardline believer in papal infallibility. The word we should just register here is that nobody wished to deny papal infallibility. Those that thought that defining at this moment and in this way and in this hurry were called inopportunists. That this wasn't the right moment to move that far, because there was a feeling it would be counterproductive, that it would inflame opinion rather than strengthen the Pope. It would actually strengthen opinion against the Pope.
Well, that is certainly Newman's position.
It's certainly Newman's position. I think we also need to just remember that from the Pope's point of view, his big problem was with overmighty Catholic rulers. It was not with Catholic situations in Protestant countries. But if you were in Protestant England, where the residual anti-Catholicism was still very strong, you could see all kinds of difficulties arising, not least in that those who were to become the bishops, those who were the rulers of the English Church ahead of the restoration of the hierarchy in 1851, had solemnly promised that there would be no decree of infallibility, because the English government didn't want to find Catholic subjects told they had to obey the Pope and not to obey the government. And now they're faced by this exactly this happening. And some of the bishops have been around in 1850. Were very embarrassed.
Well, it was the last great anti-popery riots in London were over the restoration of the hierarchy.
Indeed.
And and they were supported by no less a figure than the Prime Minister.
Indeed.
Lord John Russell. Well, of course, the Russells had rather benefited from the Reformation, so they might have had a little bias in favour of its continuation. Didn't want to give the Abbey back, as it were.
Absolutely.
But that is, in a way, to leap forward, one of the most remarkable results of the council is there isn't a schism.
No,
because actually the odds were almost on it.
Yeah, there was a small schism in Germany.
Yeah.
The Italian, the Mediterraneans, the Spaniards and the Italians are almost solidly, behind Pio Nono and infallibility. The French are split down the middle. And the Germans are pretty solidly against. Of the 700 bishops of the council, about between 150 and 200 resisted. Rather fatally, they couldn't decide at a crucial moment whether to walk out or to stay and fight. And the result of so many walking out is the Pope then claimed he had an overwhelming majority. But there was a general feeling that a decree of this importance should not be imposed against people in good conscience voting against. But they were hopelessly divided over tactics.
And Manning wasn't.
And Manning absolutely wasn't. So what's surprising is that there isn't a schism in France,
yes,
where the feelings ran extremely high. There was a small schism in Germany. In England, I think Newman played a very large part in preventing a schism.
Well, that's what I want to take us to. I mean, just remind us, perhaps, John, about what the council actually declares.
Right. Well, I did actually come prepared.
I know you did.
I did come prepared with the actual text. So it's about a 10-page text, which is essentially historical, makes rather bold, and as a historian, not as a theologian, I would say rather implausible claims.
Yes, indeed.
But at the end of it, it comes to, in view of all this, it is right that we declare this to be the case. Not when making it the case, we declare this is and always has been the case, but we're now making it clear that the Roman Pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when, in discharge of the office of pastor and teacher of all Christians, by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine regarding faith or morals to be held by the universal church, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, is possessed of that infallibility with which the divine Redeemer willed that his church should be endowed for defining doctrine regarding faith or morals, and that therefore such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the church. But if anyone, God forbid, should presume to contradict this our definition, let him be anathema. So that is unbelievably one sentence. I mean, it's almost as good as some of the collects in the Missal. But it is saying that the Pope, when he's speaking ex cathedra, sitting over the grave of Peter, and reminding himself of the charge which had been given and handed down to him from St. Peter, that when, after proper consultation, he, and he alone, made a determination, it was irreformable of itself. Now that was something that, rather surprisingly, Newman had no problem with.
Yeah, I think it's worth emphasising here just that point, that Newman's difficulty with it isn't the definition.
No.
He is not against. I mean, Newman's line is, well, nobody ever thought he wasn't infallible on such matters. Is this the right time to define it? Now, in a way, Newman is not wrong, because of course the reaction, and of course we're sitting in the cathedral house in the Diocese of East Anglia in Norwich, and just over the way there's a portrait of the Duke of Norfolk, who of course was the great donor that founded this wonderful cathedral, and of course is also the recipient of a very important letter from Newman, because of course the reaction from Germany, of course from Bismarck, it leads directly to the Kulturkampf, and real attempts by Bismarck to fight back. And in this country, of course, it's Gladstone, so closely associated with both Manning and Newman in their Oxford days, who leads the assault. I mean, really saying that obviously, going back to the fear that that 1850 and the restoration of the hierarchy, that English Catholics can't be trusted anymore. It's right back to those memories of recusancy, Elizabethan England. You can't trust an English Catholic. They are the Pope's man or woman first, and so really portraying them in the worst light.
Throughout the period of persecution, one of the most determined devices of the state was to force Catholics, in order to retain their property, in order to be able to leave their lands, their children, to denounce the papal claims, authority over them. So there were two letters we need just to look at. We'll talk about Norfolk in just a minute, but first, there's the letter to Ullathorne.
Indeed.
When the council gets going, there are widely held amongst the kind of people that Newman trusted and liked, there was widely held belief that the whole thing was being corruptly managed, that there were all kinds of malfeasance, malpractice, And he writes a rather intemperate letter, but a very lethal letter in his diagnosis to the Bishop of Birmingham, who is his own ordinary. And he uses a phrase about the arrogance of Manning.
Yes.
Ullathorne thinks it's a wonderful letter.
Which it is, actually.
Which it is. It's such a wonderful letter, he lets his friends see it.
Yes.
His friends then copy it. And his friends think it's such a wonderful letter that they show it to their friends.
Well, Newman, of course, was fatally quotable.
I know, indeed. And of course, eventually, somebody showed it to somebody who wasn't as much a friend.
Indeed.
And that friend gave it to the press.
Yeah.
Newman doesn't handle it terribly well because he denies he said that Manning was arrogant. Of course, when the letter itself was produced, he had to say well, I've only got a copy with lots of crossings out. I didn't notice that phrase survived the crossings out. So it was a bit embarrassing for him. So he does think the process is deeply flawed.
He does.
He does think that there's on top of the fact.
And to be fair, there are grounds for thinking.
Well, indeed there are. But it was the process but actually he thought the wording was unexceptionable. And he says so, and there are a number of bishops, including Clifford, the bishop of it is Clifton, isn't it?
It is.
I've got it right. Clifford of Clifton. Clifford, needs to be, stopped doing anything, too extreme, and he talks him down, and he helps him through a difficult process because there is something triumphalist about Manning.
Oh yes.
He comes back. He then exercises his claims, and he tries to tell all the bishops that they have to deny the sacraments to anyone who denies the decree. He doesn't leave it to the good judgment of each individual bishop. So of course, there's a lot of kickback against that. But then, when Clifford refuses to suspend a minister who is a great friend of his and who has given his personal fortune to build the most beautiful church in Gloucester, because he had expressed doubts about the decree. There's an attempt by Manning to have Rome to come in and to remove the man. So there was a lot of ill feeling generated by the heavy-handed way in which Manning tries to impose the decree.
And of course there's a lot of feeling that Newman, and Newman's correspondence of course at this time is full of letters from admirers basically saying please speak out against it, look what the Germans are doing, we're expecting you to do the same. And Newman is absolutely constant that the last thing he is going to do is, and I think in a way this is critical for the fledgling church in England. If Newman had decided to speak out, I think there would have been trouble. But he doesn't because I think this is a key point, isn't it, John? It's the wrong time, but it's not the wrong thing to say. And then, of course, that's where his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk comes in. It is a very, very powerful counterblast to Gladstone's nonsense.
To call it a letter, of course, is to understand. Indeed. A full-scale pamphlet.
It is indeed.
And it's an answer to Gladstone, who had expressed all that anxiety of liberal Protestants about the continuing arrogance of the Church of Rome and its interference, and the fact that they're not willing just to be obedient, sort of quiet, sort of getting on with good works. I mean, there's a lot about Catholic practice that Gladstone hugely admires. I mean, that work with one of the things Manning does is to persuade Gladstone to let Catholic nuns go to work with Florence Nightingale in the Crimea. That's an extraordinary ecumenical gesture. It's an extraordinary thing that Gladstone would agree to having Catholic nuns tending, English Tommies. But secondly, it's extraordinary that you could take nuns out of enclosure and send them off to be nurses in the Crimea. So there is that kind of sense in which there is that it's all threatened by these claims that appear to be being made. Yeah. So Gladstone takes time out to write a pretty substantial piece himself, and then Newman, rather than replying directly to Gladstone, writes to the leading Catholic layman to reassure him that it's not as bad as the Prime Minister has said. And what's usually said about it is that he makes this claim, particularly at the end, that we have an absolute duty to accept the teachings of the Church, and we have an absolute duty to follow our consciences, and our consciences must be informed, but in the end we must obey our consciences, not the Church, if the two absolutes come into clash. And there's been a great debate over that, and it is to some extent a great rhetorical flourish. But of course there's a much deeper point about Newman's reply, which is also central to the whole of his theology and the whole of his life, which is his profound sense of what he called the sensus fidelium. That in the end, whenever the Church institutionally the Church has made claims which go beyond what is right, the great body of the faithful over time, led, it has to be said, by the Catholic intellectuals, but theologians but in the end the whole Church will bed it down.
And in a way, this is one of the reasons that drew him to, right? You can see this when he's an Anglican in his book on the Arians of the 4th century.
Exactly.
I mean, it may just be, maybe only Athanasius is saying this, maybe half the Church, maybe all the bishops are all going for the semi-Arian position.
There had been Arians,
but it's wrong.
And there had been specifically bishops unambiguously in the 7th century. So he knew that in the past, it was the faithful.
That's right.
And that therefore the Pope always leads.
Yeah.
But the faithful always bed down.
And he genuinely believed that the Spirit led the Church, and in the end, that sensus fidelium would lead the Church where the Church was meant to be. It might take time.
Yeah. And he says this claim in the decree is a very general claim. It's harmless of itself. It's how it's applied.
That's right.
And to be applied, it has to be interpreted. It has to be interpreted by theologians. It has to be interpreted by canon lawyers. And again, it has to be interpreted by the people of God. And he just felt that there was nothing in that statement. And what happens? I mean, there were real worries that, for example, immediately Pio IX would take some pretty strong statements that worried people at the time, would worry people now. From the syllabus of errors, which had been promulgated a few years earlier. Now, if he converted any of those into infallible statements, like the fact that non-Catholics should have no freedom in Catholic countries, they should have no rights to. Imagine the international consequences of that. Now, Pio IX in the end backed off. He got what he wanted. It's almost as though he'd spent about 10 years obsessing about having this decree. Once he got it, he didn't know what to do with it, or he couldn't think of what to do with it. And so the next time an infallible decree was actually issued was more than 80 years later. And it's the only time it's been used.
Absolutely. I was going to say that actually there's almost a sense. I mean, Newman says at the time that we'll know in 100 years.
Yes.
And in fact, what the next century shows is that, despite, as it were, if you see the Vatican Council as the triumph of ultramontanism, in that the Pope's authority, in terms of governance and in terms of doctrine, is reinforced and reasserted.
Yeah.
What is remarkable is how little happens afterwards, because it is almost as though having got it, the power is so immense that it's really that drive, the drive that you see. So you see it early on with Manning. He comes back and he is, as you say, rather triumphalist. But actually, after a while, that goes to, and it's as though it's happened, but so what?
Yeah. And then, of course, he settles back into being a great absolutely straightforward. So, in the 1880s, he's being used on government commissions.
Well, of course, famously with the dock strike.
He supports trade unions and the formation of trade unions. He plays a really important part in the origin of the great series of teachings on social teaching. His holidays. The only holidays he ever took were to go to visit the Northern Diocese and to then go and preach in the poorest parishes. And that was his idea of a holiday. And he works with although he is sure that Protestantism is dying, and that Protestantism is going to wither away, and then the Catholic Church will be confronted with secularism. And the great final struggle will be between Catholicism and secularism, because Protestantism is now defunct. Actually, even Manning, still has really important kind of contacts with the world he'd come from. His wife dies after they've only been married for about 3 years, but from that day until the day of his death, he uses her prayer book, of course, an Anglican prayer book. And on his deathbed, he hands it to his successor, Herbert Vaughan. So that kind of link at a very personal level, and he becomes, I don't suppose he was ever a great drinker, but at some point he becomes a complete abstainer, and he sets up organisations where he works across the churches. And he's perfectly willing to on his social justice programs, he works with Bramwell Booth, for example.
Well, you can see it in his correspondence with Gladstone. I mean, they cooperate on the Education Act, a whole range of areas where Manning is, we would now call it ecumenical.
Yeah.
And it is that preferential option with the poor.
That is what links it all together.
Certainly.
And of course, Newman has an option for the poor, but for his vision is much more about the whole of society, and he is a trickle-down man. In the end, he thinks what you need is a properly trained intelligentsia, and they will in turn be the educators. So he isn't as single-minded. Not any more than Philip Neri was as single-minded as Charles Borromeo. They're two hero saints.
Well, Newman, I think, has, if you like, less faith in the power of institutions to change things, because, as you say, for him, it's the individuals. It's you change each individual, and it's each individual working together, which will enact change. But Manning is very, we've just said, and rather approvingly, and I think the letter to the Duke of Norfolk is eminently quotable, and it really does, as it were, put Gladstone back in his box. But of course, it wasn't altogether popular with some of the bishops, was it?
No. Well,
and Manning's quite useful to him there, is he not?
Yes. Well, not only bishops, actually, Propaganda Fide in Rome.
Indeed.
Were actually thinking.
Well, they were very alarmed.
Were actually thinking of disciplining Newman. And there's a wonderful letter from Manning, in which he says, "Look, his heart's in the right place. He is absolutely solid. He does express these reservations, but they're not serious compared with the bedrock." And he says, "I'm writing this," and it's a very clever letter to write, because everybody in Rome knew about their long association. "I am writing this about one of my oldest and best friends, but I'm also writing it from the point of view of prudence."
Yeah.
So don't write this off as me supporting a friend. There's a really prudential argument here that it'll be counterproductive. And Rome knows that he knows. And they know how strongly he feels about what he's achieved. And he's saying, actually, he's doing you a favour here, not doing you a disservice.
And Manning, of course, Manning's judgment, as so often, was absolutely spot on.
Absolutely.
Any attempt to have disciplined Newman over that would have been so counterproductive as to.
But there's one interesting thing, John, that they both made this journey from Anglicanism, and of course they were part of a flood.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a vast movement from, and of course they're coming over. Helped to intensify that flood. And as we come up to 1870, Newman, and more particularly the bishops with whom he was close, like Clifford, were really worried that this decree would actually slow down the flood. Manning thought it would increase it, because Manning thought what had brought him to the Church of Rome was this being fed up of being in a church that couldn't make its mind up about anything, and that there wasn't any proper centre of authority. So he thought, having an even more sharper focus of authority, people would flood in, and actually he was wrong on that.
Yeah.
So there was a slowdown for a while, and then it picks up again. But it is worth noting that something like 15% of the priests in the 1880s were former Anglicans.
Yeah.
I mean, it anticipates, what happened after 1992.
Very much so.
On that scale. And it is also the case, of course, that one of the things that gives both of them some difficulties is there is a certain degree of jealousy and a certain degree, and there's some pretty horrible things said about. There's some horrible things said about them as former Anglicans. I mean, there's a lovely. I mean, I don't know how bitchy clergy can be.
As if.
I'm afraid. But there's a wonderful thing where that's as Newman goes round. I'm now forgetting which one it is. Oh Lord, it could be either of them. But it's about these former Anglicans that they are apostles to the gentles, not to the Gentiles, the gentles. Because they both did use their contacts with other, strong converts. There was big lay converts as well.
Well, there are one of Manning's fears about Newman, of course, expressed at this time, is that Newman does what's he called it represent the old Anglican patristic Oxford way of thinking, and I think that does reflect the fact that Manning had much more acclimatized to Rome. But I think sometimes though that I think can lead us astray, because there is a misunderstanding at the time that Newman gets his cardinalate, but the plain fact of the matter is that Manning, well, I'll let you tell the story, but Manning plays a crucial role in it.
He does. He does. I mean, it has to wait until Pio Neo dies, and it's fairly early in the pontificate of Leo XIII.
But it's quite an extraordinary circumstance.
Well, you remind me.
Well, I mean, what is Newman at this point? He's a parish priest.
Oh yes, exactly.
He's a parish priest. He doesn't. The misunderstanding with the Manning and the Pope is over Newman's understanding that he would have to go to Rome, which was normal.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to. He wasn't going to. So the whole thing looks as though it's fallen apart at that point. And then, but Manning intervenes.
Well, Manning intervenes both to make it sure that despite their disagreements, he thinks this is the right thing to do, but also that a very special privilege should be conferred on him, that he can remain doing his. Now, it's important that Pio Nono really suffered fools not at all gladly, and he was.
He had quite a strict definition of who was a fool as well.
Indeed, so, and Clifton, Clifford. I keep on getting his diocese mixed up with his name. Clifford made a very, very powerful and deeply considered speech at the council for the inopportunity of it. And when Pio Nono, he went to see Pio Nono, he was called to see Pio Nono, and in front of a lot of strangers, Pio Nono says to him, "You only said that because I didn't give you Westminster." And that is shocking, because the last thing that Clifford was doing
Clifford's not an
was
opportunist,
settling scores with the Pope, and it was a shocking thing. But the thing is that Pio Nono himself invited Newman to come to the council to be a peritus, to be an advisor. He knew he knew his views, but so great was his intellectual standing, so revered was he as a thinker about the church and about the history of the church and the tradition of the church, that he was someone who should be listened to. So at no point did anybody sort of trivialise him in the way that they trivialised other opponents. And I think that's really, I think
it is
very significant.
And I think, again,
of course it's right. I mean, you know, history is vindicated.
Well, let's face it, you know, I mean, in a way, the what has happened is that although Manning dominated the horizon in a way during their lifetimes in the Catholic horizon, Newman, of course, is now a saint. Remains, and at some point, if he's not a doctor of the church, I think we should both be amazed. But it is right to rescue Manning as well, and it's perhaps good to end this conversation about them both with something again that, because of the way some of these histories have been written, doesn't get mentioned. What happens after Newman's death, in terms of who is it gives the great oration?
Exactly. With all the generosity, I don't think there's ever a point at which Manning, even when he thought that Newman was making mistakes, didn't understand the integrity that underlay it. He never doubted Newman's integrity, even if at times Newman doubted his. And so when someone who has been a very good friend lets you down, as Manning did in preaching that sermon on anti-popish sermon from Newman's pulpit 3 months after Newman has left the church, to be treated as Manning then was, as a pariah, and never to give up on knowing that Newman was acting out of pain, out of feeling betrayed, but with integrity. And I think Manning's capacity for forgiveness and for understanding what it was that was driving Newman, that was a search after truth, faithfulness to the gospel, faithfulness to the great tradition of the church, the great fathers of the church. I think there was not only intellectual respect, there was a deep sense in Manning I think I just can't use any word of Newman's towering integrity.
And I think both of them, to finish us off, both of them give, from different angles, something to the Catholic Church in this country at the crucial time of its reformation that no one else could have given. And I think it's right that, sitting here as we are in the Cathedral House, we acknowledge the contribution of both those great Catholics.
Yes.
John, it's been a huge pleasure. I hope our audience has enjoyed it. And I should just put in a plug that in a parallel series on the 11th of June, I shall be talking to the Reverend Giles Fraser about his new book, Chosen, which should be a treat as well. But John, I can't close this without thanking you so much for what I think was, and there really was no script, but maybe that showed too. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, John.
And thank you, our audience.